Hello and welcome to Meliorist Writes. I'm Ezra Harker-Shaw, and today I'm just going to be talking to you a little bit about reading as a writer, about the kind of reading habits that I personally think are really useful to have as a writer and that I think will improve your writing and your writing experience. I am thoroughly of the camp that believes that to be a writer, to be a really good writer, you really have to be a reader. And it's something I get a lot with undergraduate students, that they'll kind of ask me, say, well, look, I don't really enjoy reading that much. I really enjoy writing. And to them, I kind of say, like, if you just want to write for yourself, if you just want to treat that as kind of your way of processing the world, that's fine. But if you want to improve your craft of writing and if you want to get published, you really have to read. And I think if you enjoy writing, you're probably going to enjoy reading once you find the right thing. But I imagine an awful lot of the people who are listening to this are avid readers already, or perhaps occasional readers, people who have all kinds of different reading patterns and habits. I know for me, I'm a huge person of habits when it comes to reading, and I go through phases of reading huge amounts just because it kind of fits into my daily life. I love a good train commute. It's a great time to just always have a book, and if you can get a solid hour of reading in on the train, that's just delightful for me. But I know when I don't have those commuting times, I don't necessarily have a good reading habit. Sometimes I get into that nice habit of reading before bed. That's always good. Gets you nice and sleepy, as long as you're not reading anything too exciting. So I find that very pleasant. But again, sometimes it doesn't fit in with your life. If you want to incorporate more reading into your life, thoroughly recommend just trying to carve out that regular time, and before bed I always find it's a nice one. I'm also a huge audiobook fan, as anyone who knows me knows. When I listen to a really good audiobook, I almost always end up buying a copy of the paper book because I want to be able to have it to hand. I want to be able to open it and flick through it and mark pages and highlight my favourite sections and lend it to people, say this book is brilliant. So I do kind of find I often end up doubling up. But I love listening to audiobooks. I love being able to do that while I'm walking my dog, while I'm doing the dishes, while I'm doing whatever kind of little bits of regular life that don't involve my mind too much. And I love spending the time with somebody reading a book to me. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is how to find new books. And one of the things I started doing was following readers. When I would listen to an audiobook and would really like the performance of the reader, I would just look up that reader and say, okay, what else have you done? And that sometimes led me to books I wasn't too interested in, but every now and then you just hit on someone who's maybe got a slightly similar taste to you and who you like listening to, and that's a lovely way to get in. But why does reading improve your writing? That's a question I want to talk about today. I think being a really good writer is a lot about observing the world and thinking about observing the world and communicating what you have observed. I think that's really important, deciding what you want to say about it. And so that involves kind of staying awake, staying alert a lot of the time, looking around, and being a good observer is a wonderful gift for a writer. As much as having a great imagination, I think more so, actually. Having that real kind of sensitivity to what's going on around you and just taking note of the little things. But I think reading can be a lovely way to introduce you, yes, to a lot of these little things, and you can often get into the subtlety of, say, a person's psyche in a way that you couldn't, I suppose we rarely do with people in real life. If I think about the real people in real life who I've really fully understood their motives, there's probably just a handful of people, a handful of kind of close friends, people I've gotten to know here and there that I really understand. But, through books, there are so many people I've kind of glimpsed, this is why I do the things I do kind of mentality. And I think that's wonderful. But I think a really significant thing is not just, on one hand, both of these things I want to say, it is both understanding the human condition, the thing that we're all trying to say, having yet more views of that, but I think really significantly the second thing is seeing other ways to say that. And that is a place where reading is just invaluable, because we were all going to say things slightly differently, and with every new attempt, we're going to get a little bit closer. One of my favourite definitions of literature, I suppose, one of my favourite kind of definitions of what I'm all looking for in literature, which is lovely because it is an example of itself, is a quote from Alexander Pope, who I believe was saying that, I forget the exact context, but something along the lines of what good poetry is what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. And I think, to me, that's what great writing is when you have that something that you've been kind of feeling at some point in your mind, and then you read it and you go, yes, this is it. Somebody has written it down. Somebody has noted it for me. I'm not alone in this thing. Wonderful. Good. I understand it better now because somebody else has taken the time to process it and to write it down. That's what I'm aiming for, I think, when I'm really pleased with my writing. It's so often because I've hit on something that I've maybe pondered about, puzzled with, grappled with for some time. So in a way, I'm kind of separating out here content and style. I think sometimes I've spoken to a few writers who've said they're nervous when it comes to style. They're nervous about reading other people's writing too much in case the style influences them. And to them I always say, read widely then. You know, if you sort of fear that your style is going to end up mimicking Virginia Woolf, for instance, if you're reading lots of Virginia Woolf, and great, lovely, she's a fantastic writer, maybe you're feeling, I actually think I'm sometimes getting into the cadences of the sort of the rhythms of Woolf's writing styles. I would say read something completely different, put that down for a day. I try to be very varied in my reading patterns, and I definitely go down rabbit holes and end up spending, a whole summer just reading books that are published in, 1800 to 1810 or something. I'll just, whatever bee will get into my bonnet, and that is great fun. But I think, in this specific instance, force yourself out of that comfort zone. Maybe have one of those books on the go, but make sure you're also reading some Samuel Beckett. Make sure you're reading something completely different, some Norman Mailer, just whatever you've got that's just going to be something at the other, I say at the other extreme, just something that's trying to do, maybe even something that's doing the same thing, but maybe something that's doing something completely different in a completely different style. I think finding your own style is always going to be, your style will always be to some extent in response to the other writers that you have heard, that you have encountered. Because we're not alone. We don't conjure a magnificent style out of nothing, because we don't conjure language out of nothing. This isn't an abstract art form. Everything we're writing grows out of what we've heard before. Every choice we make, if we make a choice to sound more colloquial or more pretentious or more educated, all of these things are choices that we are making in response to other people we have heard speak, other people we have heard write. So I think one should never shy away from other writers for fear of being influenced. I think one should be very careful, and there's, it's an interesting thing with style, because I know sort of two different camps, writers who are very meticulous about their style in terms of, yes, I shall do this exact thing. I shall write with, lots of adjectives, and I shall write with long sentences. People making these kind of very stylistic choices. I will write using imagery from the sea. Lovely, great. And I know other people who are completely unconscious about it, I think, and just kind of write and then look back and go, I suppose I used lots of adjectives and long sentences and images of the sea. I hadn't realised that. I think it's always, I think for the sort of the latter camp, I think I think I probably fall closer to the the former camp, for whichever camp, I think you need to kind of, I'm going backwards and forwards here, but I think whichever camp you're in, you need to do a little bit of the other as well, even if you're having to push yourself to do it. If you are somebody who just kind of writes and then see what comes out, I think it's nice to then go back, say, okay, what am I doing? What are my stylistic choices? And do I want them? Do I actually want to do this? Am I sounding a little bit, maybe my language choice is a little too forced? Maybe sometimes I'm trying to use some, high level vocabulary, multi-syllable words here to kind of show off a bit. Does that actually suit my characters? Does that suit the world I'm writing? Does it suit what I want to say? And being conscious about that and making that decision, I think, is really good. And then, go back through when you're editing and correct, unify. You can make homage to certain writers. Yes, absolutely. I think that can be a lovely thing to do when you're sort of reading in the style of somebody, without somebody sort of ripping somebody off, but just kind of, oh yes, this has definitely got something in a kind of manner of somebody else. I think that is fine, but I think it's good to do it mindfully, and not to be unconsciously just borrowing that voice, and not to be completely stealing that and not bringing any of yourself in. If you're not bringing any of yourself in, I think it will feel flat. So my big thing is read, and read widely, and read bizarrely, and read well. So the second big thing that I want to say here is make your reading count for you. I take notes on what I read. I used to do this absolutely, copiously. There would be so many notes. There'd be so many thoughts and trackings and everything. And that was very much kind of when I was in the depths of study, and had, I think, more energy than I have now, certainly. But one thing I always, or at least certainly always try to do, one thing I definitely always do is write down every single book I read. Even if I don't finish a book, if I read, a chunk of it, I'll just make a note of it. I've got a sort of a diary kind of thing, and I just have a page in there where I just write this book, and I try and put them roughly, and maybe I'll put a date when I finish it or a date when I start it or something. And if I only read a few chapters of something, I'll note that. And basically, I just find it quite nice when I look back, either to see, when was I reading, or what was I reading when I was writing this, or what was I, have I read this before? I find that quite useful, just to kind of see. And looking back, at the end of the year, it's nice to go, I've read, last year, we're in January as I record this. Last year, I think I read 56 books. And I looked back at those, and I was going, oh yes, right, I remember those. I'd kind of forgotten about some of those from February last year. That's quite nice to see them. So I recommend that. But the other thing that I recommend as well is just, I think, at bare minimum, at least just write the titles down. But what I really like to do is, I've got a document where I keep a track of my writing, but you can have a notebook for this. I used to have a notebook for this. But I found the document was actually better. It's a sort of Google Doc thing that I can access on my phone or on a computer or wherever. Where I just note, firstly, my initial thoughts when I'm reading a book. If I've gotten far enough through that I can kind of go, okay, this is what's happening. These are my expectations. And then I also, when I finish it, add a few notes. And depending on how much the book was an influence to me, how useful I think the book is, I will write more or less. Sometimes I write a whole page, and that's a full kind of analysis, not so much of necessarily, sometimes it's how the book did what it did, and sometimes it's just what the book made me think. I felt this, I didn't like this character, this was exciting, this bit was really boring, I would have definitely cut this bit out, stuff like that. It's not for anyone else, it's entirely for myself. But the thing I find really useful as a writer is looking back at those early notes, when I've written just a couple of lines or two, when I'm part way through a book. I find it interesting seeing how my responses to a book change, particularly when you're thinking about selling a book, if you're thinking about, if you're marketing your own works, or if you're trying to sell them to publishers or agents or something, you've got that sort of window to get people's attention. You've got your book cover, you've got your book title, you've got your own name or whatever name you're putting on your book, you've got your blurb, you've got your first few chapters. I read so many first few chapters, and then just quite frankly, I haven't got... I think there's not enough life for me to spend time reading books I don't enjoy, so I certainly don't finish everything I start. If something doesn't grab me, I send it off into the world and wish it all the best to find another reader. But for me, I'm going to keep looking for something I like. So it's quite a short time, and it's very interesting when I look at kind of what I think a story is going to be, especially if it's something I end up loving. I've recently read The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, which is a book I think I was recommended by an algorithm. It was a book that kind of came up, and I saw it was a historical piece, and I sort of went, right, I'll have a go at that. And I really enjoyed the first two chapters, but there was one thing that was really irritating me, was that it was a historical fiction that had some real characters and some imagined characters, and I was getting frustrated trying to work out where the divide was. Interestingly, the first few notes that I read, I finished it not so long ago, and the first few notes that I'd written on that book were all about the character who turns out to be sort of the father of the main character. And he isn't actually, he's around, but he's not the focus of the book. But those first few chapters, I was kind of, I wrote a little bit about him and how he wasn't kind of, he was an okay character, but I was more interested in his circumstance and his situation. He's working at Kew, or his father is working at Kew, and he ends up sort of getting involved with Joseph Banks. And so I found that all quite interesting, but I did think he as a character was sort of, I found him a little bit, maybe a little abrasive. I didn't really engage with him as a character. Now, I enjoyed very much it being at Kew. I enjoyed that Joseph Banks was in it. That was definitely the kind of thing that was going to hook me as a reader. So in that way, I think it was a really good start to the book. But it wasn't in any way about the main character, whose name was Alma, who I really came to love by the end of the book, and I really think she's a very remarkable character. So I think that's a really interesting choice for your beginning of your book. Did it work? Yes, it hooked at least one reader. I believe it's hooked quite a few. And it set the time. It mentioned the kind of people that someone who might be interested in that book would be interested in, people like Joseph Banks. So I think it was a really sensible choice, but perhaps a slightly unusual one. And that's the kind of thing that making those notes is going to be so helpful for you, just to kind of think about your own text. What choices have authors made, and what kind of choices are you making? Always be reflecting back. Every time you see something good, just say, okay, that's interesting. Or actually also, really insightfully, when you see something bad, that's interesting. What has this person done? How am I approaching this particular element of my writing? How can I do something good like that? Or how can I avoid doing something bad like that? I've mentioned reading widely. I asked people on the social media, the internet, and also real people. Some of them, I believe, are the same people. I believe some of the real people exist on the internet and vice versa. But I've been asking people, how do you find books to read? Because it's something I'm intrigued about. I suppose as a writer trying to sell my work, I'm interested to know how people come across books. But also as a reader, I sometimes get frustrated that I can't find the sort of thing I want to read at any given moment. And I got some really interesting examples. I got absolutely loads of answers from this. I've been writing down from all the people, I spoke to about 100 people or something, which is really wonderful. I'm surrounded by bookish people. I'm very lucky to be surrounded by bookish people who are very happy to talk about this. And some not so bookish people as well, some people who just kind of read now and then rather than just writers and academics. So I wanted to just kind of run through some of these, both to give you an inspiration of where you can find other books to read, but also to kind of flag up some ways that maybe aren't helpful patterns for you in kind of reading things. One thing that I came to wonder is who is choosing what you read? And that's something I think about sometimes of, when I pick up a book, who's got the power to dictate what I get to read? I love bookshops. I love being in bookshops. I love, I'll often go into your Waterstones, your Foyles, your what have you. And so often you get the same titles on those stores. And I've worked in bookselling, and I've worked with authors and publishers that I know a decent bit about the publishing industry, and I know what a very kind of complex and fame and money driven machine it is. And so sometimes I find I can't get away from the titles released by the big publishers that are being pushed by, there's being a lot of money put to make sure that people like me see this title and only this title. And those kind of books, and I don't say this to say anything against those individual books, because so often they're absolutely fantastic. But there is something about the publishing industry in the UK today that those books are shopping in real world bookshops. They can really overwhelm. And when I go to independent bookshops and I see those same books, I often kind of feel kind of sad, because I'm going, the one thing I was really hoping for here is I was going to get a real person curating these selections. So I'm always hopeful when I go to an independent bookshop that I can find something a little unusual. And while I completely understand they want to have the big sellers, they want to make their money, of course. It's always nice to see a little bit of character coming in there. Just a little bit of, how nice, how unusual of you to stock this particular different little thing. I wonder why somebody has chosen this. Quite a few people, while I'm talking about bookshops, a few people said they like the kind of the staff recommendations. When you get that little handwritten book review on the shelf, that is so just feels of being a little bit closer. Somebody has cared about this enough to scribble something down, and that's a nice kind of way through it. The next kind of logical step is jumping online. A good few unsurprising responses from Goodreads, from BookTok, Instagram, people just kind of saying, following people who recommend things a lot. Interestingly, both the bookshop and the online the online more kind of traditional marketing, I suppose, online traditional places where you would find books, there were far fewer of those responses than people saying recommendations from people. And I'm so sorry to all the marketers who were looking for some insight of absolute gold, but recommendations from people was the big thing. And sometimes that was people saying, I love hanging out with voracious readers, and I always ask them, what do you read? What do you share? Somebody else said to me that they always felt that their favourite books were books that somebody had actually pressed into their hand, and that resonated with me so much. I have a few books that I have such huge love for, and I can remember the person who went, you have to read this book. I've read this book. It made me think of you. And that adds to the book. I know that adds to the book. I know that as much as those individual books I have really sincerely loved, the fact that somebody kind of thought of me is certainly a connecting point in my head there. Some other things that came up: book clubs. Yep, cheap. Which book is the cheapest? I think that's always nice. We've all kind of done that a little bit, haven't we? Of going, oh, I could get this, or I could get this. Well, this one's £3 cheaper. Brilliant, run! Two big things that I think need to be discussed. The author. Have I read anything by this author before? Great. Yes, of course. That's such a, you're going to be spending time with this person. If you already know them, that is a huge benefit. A huge kind of indicator of whether or not you're going to like the book. There's a danger, I think, getting stuck with your same old authors. I think I've definitely fallen into that rut sometimes of just looking for things by people I've already read. And sometimes that's a comfort thing. You don't quite want to step out into something different. But your reading can get stale, I think, if you're kind of doing that and just turning over the same few people. And one that I thought was really nice was looking at the publisher, and a friend was saying that they tend to have a few sort of smaller publishers that they know very well, that they've kind of been following, and they keep an eye out for them, and that's always a kind of a seal of approval when they find. And I think actually that's something that probably a lot of casual readers don't necessarily look at too closely. So I would recommend if you've really enjoyed a book, have a look at the publisher or have a look at the imprint, and just maybe that might be a nice stepping stone into what else have they done. I always want to ask people what they're reading, because I think you find really unusual things. It's something I love to do when I'm doing maybe a workshop or a university class. I will just say, look, what's one of the best books that you've read? And it doesn't have to be fiction or poetry or whatever we might be talking about that day. It's is it a kind of 19th century French novel, or is it a non-fiction book about clockmaking? Wonderful, when someone cares enough to say, well, this is my favorite book, that's a wonderful kind of sidestep into a completely different world. And I do read, I'm reading more non-fiction now than I think I have before, and I'm reading non-fiction about things that I'm not interested in already. I think for quite a long time the only non-fiction I was reading was, I'm interested in this period of history, this type of art, this element of natural science or something, and then would kind of dive into those books. But now I'm just kind of going, this is just a well-written bit of non-fiction. I know nothing about whoever it might be about, if it's a biography of somebody or if it's just a history of a time and place. I don't know. Wonderful. That's a really nice way to kind of, when you find something that's really well received, well spoken of, dive into it and see where that takes you. But I think one thing I want to leave you with this question of reading, what you're reading, where you're getting it from, is just to remember that who's choosing it for you. I think that's a really interesting thought. How has this book come to you? Has it come to you because of a huge mass marketing campaign with the, breakfast TV show and sponsorship by celebrity host? Has it come to you because it's got a celebrity's name on it and it's been kind of ghostwritten? Maybe is that... Those aren't necessarily bad books, but I don't know, I feel like they don't always have journeys that are particularly rewarding. I suppose I just want to say listen to the journey that this book has had to get to you, and see what that says to you about that book. How important is that story, and how has it found its way into you? I'm going to round up. I'm going to try and do a little recommended reading at the end of every session. I'm going to recommend the book I mentioned already, actually, the Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert. How did I find this book? This was actually, this book I would not have picked up. I haven't read anything by Elizabeth Gilbert before, and I didn't recognise the name, or I didn't know how to pinpoint the name when I picked it up. I sort of went, all right, okay, sure, I'll have a look at this. And this is a really interesting case of if I had realised that she was the author of Eat, Pray, Love, I probably wouldn't have picked up the book, because I just have a vague association of what that book is, or more what the movie about that book is, and it doesn't really seem like my thing, and I probably wouldn't have read that book, and I'm really glad that I did pick up that book, because it was really wonderful. It's kind of about a woman in in the 18th century, an American woman, a botanist, who is, I think, she's not exceptional. Like, I mean, she is very, very intelligent. This is pointed out a lot of the time. She is a fictional woman, but I think there's this idea that there were so many people like her, living lives like hers, who were sort of largely unrecorded in a lot of ways. Which is not to say that she has an ordinary life. She has a very interesting life. She has various ups and downs with, friends and families and loves. She ends up going to Tahiti, which is a really interesting section of the book, kind of seeing somebody who has sort of lived in Philadelphia their entire life kind of suddenly setting out across the world. And then into her old age. I found that particularly beautiful, as she's kind of coming to some of the conclusions that Darwin comes to in his Origin of Species, and then kind of watching other people write similar things. I think it's really beautifully done. It's very sensitively done. She writes very well about, I think, the relatable, mundane human emotions. I say mundane, they're not mundane when we feel them, but they are commonplace. But she presents them with the intensity that we feel them with, but also situates that in a historical setting. And that felt lovely. Sometimes when we're reading historical characters, either we're reading something set at the time, which is just in a different vibe, a different idiom than we currently live in, with different values. And so sometimes we feel very distanced from characters because the things authors say about those characters are not the things that we say about the characters now. And sometimes when we read historical narratives, we feel that an author has put their own contemporary voice onto this historical character. And I think Gilbert really nicely meshes those two things, because it is definitely an 18th century woman shown through contemporary eyes, but it doesn't feel false at any point. The language in the writing feels very faithful, actually. There's a lot of kind of, at first it felt a little bit too historical almost. It felt like a non-fiction book at the very start of the book, and then it kind of got into the drama and things started to feel a bit more sort of comfortable novelish. You never forget that it's set in the time and place that it's set. But it shows us a side of this person that simply wouldn't have been written about in that way, but that responds very much to our modern sensibilities. There are some beautiful set pieces. There is a moment when our main character is a child, and she's at a lecture that's being held at her house, where all the people get to are arranged out on the lawn and have to orbit each other as planets, and they're all given different planetary roles. And she, as a child, is given a flaming torch and told she can run through the middle of them and be a comet. And that is just described so beautifully, as such a powerful moment. It sort of feels sort of charged. There's a slight sense of, to me there was a slight sense of dread that maybe something was going to go terribly wrong or something was going to be terribly exciting. This really feels like the sort of the making of a person. And it's described in a way that I think I kind of look back on that moment with the same level of fondness that character will look back on that moment in her old age. It's really beautifully captured. So that's a strong recommendation for The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert. It ties in very much to what I'm planning to do for my next podcast, which is to talk about historical fiction, and especially the ethics of writing historical fiction, when you're writing about real people, or whether you're writing more kind of just inventing characters and putting them back in a real historical setting. that's everything I want to say for now. Take care, my darlings. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I'll talk to you soon.